This lecture is being given by myself, Claudia Ringler, as well as Elizabeth Bryan and Quinn Bernier, all from the Environment and Production Technology Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C. The topic, I think, is very important, and I hope a topic that excites all of you, and it's on gender, collective action, and climate change. The results are drawn from two research projects that both focus on the linkage between gender and climate change. One has the specific topic that you see here, and it has been funded by the German government. And the second project has been supported by CCAFs directly and is titled Increasing Women's Resilience to Climate Change. With no further ado, I would like to lay out the key messages or learning outcomes from the research, and I really hope that all of you will do more research in this area in the future. So perceptions of climate change, needs as a result of climate change, and possibilities to adapt to climate change really do differ between men and women, and that's a very important finding. There has been a lot of anecdotal evidence, but we now really increased the actual research findings on that. It is really therefore important and essential to take a gendered approach to climate change adaptation. To date, we are very far from a gendered approach to climate change adaptation. Norms and customs, education and research systems, development agencies, and extension systems are not yet geared up to address climate change in a gendered fashion. But it's important, that just saying, okay, now I'm doing gender and climate change, and I can easily address all the problems. This is unfortunately not the case, because the gender differentiated impacts of climate change are not straightforward, and they're also not predictable. They vary by context, and there could be socio-cultural context, economic context, ecological, and obviously also political context. But on the positive end, there's many methods to better understand gender climate change issues and also to address these issues. And this presentation draws on several of them. So to start out, what's different with climate change? Obviously there are gender issues, there are natural resource management issues, but why is climate change different? So climate change brings about a very high degree of uncertainty. And so it's important to understand the risk perceptions of households, especially of rural households, and separately of women and men. Given this high uncertainty and also some of the extreme events and impacts of climate change, traditional forms of collective action, of group-based approaches may not be enough, and the resources may not be sufficient. There are also very dynamic feedback loops. So adverse climate change impacts can lead into a downward spiral of reduced consumption, then reduced education, and then if you have further climatic shocks, this could really lead to long-term adverse outcomes. Climate change does and can impact the assets of both men and women, but in different ways. And there are likely differential impacts on both land and water assets, which are really key to agricultural production. The assets can be also destroyed in extreme events, such as floods, or sold to cope with shocks. Therefore, climate change may overwhelm the coping capacity of the traditional organizations that are and have supported people in need. Importantly, adaptation options to climate change require investments by farmers. So it's very important that they do have the assets and the capacity to adapt to climate change. But public and private investments are also needed. Another difference that we have with climate change is that we need to differentiate between climate extremes, so where we usually have coping mechanisms, and with long-term climate change adaptation. And any research that you do in the socioeconomics of climate change, you should be very clear which of the two topics you're addressing. And of course, they're highly interrelated. So now that we have said what's different with climate change, so why do we talk about gender? Here the important point is that household is not a unitary unit, but there are men, women, obviously also children in the household, and decisions in households are taken as a result of a bargaining process. And that bargaining process depends on the control and access to various assets. And that could be financial assets, social assets, physical assets. But it also depends on the risk and motivations and values of the members in the household. Generally, men and women have their own interests, as you might know. Preferences and needs also differ, and that will influence the final decisions on climate change adaptation. And all these decisions are taken in the context of social norms, opportunities, and practices that structure the access to resources, information, and technologies. And all of that together can improve or make it more difficult to adopt climate change adaptation measures. So what is the linkage between climate change and gender? As you probably already know in this course, have learned, climate change is particularly disastrous for the rural poor. Despite that, there is just still not much research and evidence on the differential impacts of climate change on women versus men. There's basically three important linkages between climate change and gender that we have decided to focus on. The first one is assets. I've already mentioned the term, and it's defined here to include secure land and water rights, agricultural technologies, livestock, knowledge, and social capital. So the hypothesis is that these assets are important and help women and men and households to cope with climate shocks and adapt to climate change. So we have to look at the linkage between gender and climate change through this asset lens. And the second one is group-based approaches. There's evidence that such approaches can help women and men to enhance access or control over assets, and they can also, therefore, enhance climate resilience. But there are other studies out there that suggest that participation in groups actually reduces the likelihood that individual farmers adapt to climate change. And finally, both assets and group-based approaches, the outcomes are, we believe, are much stronger if women and men have the social capital and the collective action mechanisms to achieve these outcomes. So social capital and collective action are directly linked to resilience and climate change adaptation. And I now hand over to Elizabeth Bryan, who is the author of the Conceptual Framework that brings all these pieces together.
This conceptual framework illustrates the pathways through which climate change affects the well-being of individuals, households, and groups and communities. This framework draws on several others, including the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework developed by DFID, the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework by Elinor Ostrom, IFPRI's Gender and Assets Framework, and the Third Assessment Report of the IPCC, in order to incorporate issues related to gender and assets, institutional analysis, sustainable livelihoods, and climate change. The first element in the framework is the climate signal, which includes long-term changes in average climate conditions, as well as changes in climate variability, such as changes in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, like droughts and floods. The ways in which the climate changes influences human vulnerability and the types of actions that are taken in response. The impact of climate change on the well-being of individuals, households, and groups, and their ability to respond to those changes depends on the context in which climate change occurs. Here we define the context of vulnerability in terms of 4 components. We call the first component user characteristics. Some examples of user characteristics include the types of livelihood activities that a person, household, or community engages in. It also includes the types of asset holdings that individuals, households, and communities have. We consider assets to include both tangible assets such as physical, financial, and natural resource capital, as well as intangible assets such as human and social capital. Social differentiation, including gender, socioeconomic status, and ethnicity, is also an important user characteristic. In this project, we focus primarily on the gender-differentiated impacts and responses to climate change. Another important user characteristic has to do with the cognitive abilities of the actor, including their ability to perceive climate risk, their values, and their beliefs. Biophysical characteristics, the second component in the vulnerability context, refer to the sensitivity of the physical and ecological systems on which people depend. These physical systems often have a threshold beyond which change becomes irreversible, and adaptation options are limited. The third component relates to information and technology. Traditional coping strategies are insufficient to deal with unprecedented climate changes. Individuals, households, and communities must adapt to a new reality to become resilient to climate change. This requires information on the types of climate changes that are expected, as well as the information on appropriate technologies and strategies to deal with those changes. The fourth component in the vulnerability context deals with institutional arrangements. These include markets, laws, policies, organizations, and social and cultural norms that influence how an individual, household, group, or community perceives, is affected by, and responds to climate change. For example, social and cultural norms influence the extent to which individuals and groups within a community are able to participate in and benefit from collective adaptation efforts. All of these components of the vulnerability context shape the ways in which individuals, households, and groups respond to climate change. In this framework, actors use their decision-making power and resources to adapt to climate change, given the vulnerability context in which they operate. Adaptation decisions, typically associated with positive outcomes, involve changing farm practices, livelihood diversification, asset accumulation, investments in human and social capital, and natural resource management. Actors can also work collectively to manage climate risk through participation in group savings and credit schemes and labor sharing arrangements, for example. Actors with few resources, assets, and decision-making authority are more likely to resort to coping mechanisms, such as reducing consumption, asset depletion, and delaying investments in human and social capital development. These adaptation decisions, or lack thereof, affect well-being outcomes, such as income, livelihood security, and empowerment. Importantly, this conceptual framework illustrates the dynamic nature of resilience to climate change. That is to say, the well-being outcomes in a particular time period determine the context in which future adaptation decisions can be made.
As a key first step of this project, we needed to identify who the key actors were in each of the case study countries. We wanted to identify these partners as these key actors as potential partners. In addition, to find out which organizations could make use of the research findings in their activities, and ultimately to derive implications for the communication and outreach strategy of the research project. We therefore conducted a stakeholder analysis in each of the 4 case study countries, Kenya, Bangladesh, Mali, and Ethiopia. To do this, we used a participatory mapping tool called Netmap. Netmapping is a participatory interview technique that combines social network analysis, stakeholder mapping, and power mapping. Netmap helps people understand, visualize, discuss, and improve situations in which many different actors influence outcomes. By creating maps, individuals and groups can clarify their own view of a situation, foster discussion, and develop a strategic approach to their networking activities. It can also help outsiders understand and monitor complex multi-stakeholder situations. In particular, Netmap allows stakeholders to examine not only the formal interactions in the network, but also the informal interactions that cannot be understood by merely studying documents concerning the formal policy-making procedures. To get a realistic understanding of these formal and informal links and how the actors use them to influence the policy process, empirical fieldwork is crucial, as only the formal links can be deducted from government documents. To understand how the actors interact with each other in the process, social network analysis approaches are especially suitable, as they allow for a complex representation of a system, putting the actions of individuals and organizations into a greater perspective. Social network analysis explains the achievements of actors and the developments within groups of actors by looking at the structure of linkages between these actors. So we'll now look at a network analysis from the Ethiopia case study. The questions that we use to frame this activity are: what actors are involved in the climate change adaptation? Who is giving advice to whom among the actors? How much influence does each actor have over improving the ability of farmers and pastoralists or fishers to adapt to climate impacts? And what are the priorities and core activities of each of these actors in terms of climate change adaptation? So the structural characteristics of the networks show how information and funding flows among actors and has implications for who controls these flows. This network is highly centralized. That is, a few core actors have a high concentration of links, whereas many actors have few links. Furthermore, here, core actors are seen as having a high concentration of power or control of information in the network relative to other actors. So here we can see that there are 5 core actors in this network and 36 peripheral actors. The core actors include the Ethiopian Environmental Protection Authority, the EPA, the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, MOARD, the Prime Minister's Office, the Delegation of the European Commission, and the Pastoral Forum. Among the core actors are 3 key government actors: the Ethiopian Environmental Protection Authority, the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, and the Prime Minister's offices. These 3 actors not only fall graphically in the middle of the network and have the highest number of links, but they were also seen as having the highest influence. Clustered around these actors, we also find a variety of international and UN organizations with medium influence. We are also interested in which actors have direct links to farmers and pastoralists. So we see a handful of international NGOs that link directly to the target communities, but we also see that the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development also links to farmers, and the Ministry of Federal Affairs links to pastoralists. So the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development provides advice such as agricultural extension, and funding through the Protective Safety Nets program to farmers. The Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development also has a high influence score here as well, which is understandable given the large role that agriculture plays in the country. The Ministry of Federal Affairs provides funding to pastoralists through the Pastoral Community Development Program. We finally also see clusters of civil society and NGOs emerging around issues related to climate change adaptation and pastoral issues. These groups engage with themselves and the government. So what can we learn about the key actors and their interactions from this Netmap activity, and what does it say about communication and outreach for research results? First, the most striking takeaway is that the policy network in Ethiopia is highly centralized around a few key government actors. But we also see an opportunity in the other clusters of NGOs and civil society networks that could be opportunity points for engaging and disseminating information on some of these issues. So after the first step of identifying key actors through net mapping, we wanted to know more about these key actors. Specifically, we wanted to find more about the perceptions of the organizations involved and their responses to the challenges of climate change, and assess the knowledge and capacity of the organizations to respond to the different climate impacts and climate changes. So the questions that we posed in this activity, the Knowledge, Attitude, and Practices Survey, were: what is the capacity of organizations in designing and implementing climate change adaptation activities in focus countries? What is the level of capacity for and importance given by organizations to gender analysis related to climate change adoption activities in focus countries? And what are the main barriers and constraints faced by organizations working on climate change issues in focus countries? We used a methodology called Knowledge, Attitudes, and Practices, which is commonly used as a diagnostic tool to understand knowledge, capacities, activities, and perceptions of individuals and members of organizations or communities. An important step in the KAP methodology is to carefully identify the indicators and measures of knowledge, capacity, activities, and perceptions that are relevant to the study objectives. So, following a literature review, the project identified the following indicators for organizational capacity for climate change-related work. These include clarity of mission and mandate on climate change, policy, or strategy on climate change, adequacy of resources, both physical and financial, human resources, staff motivation, organization and management systems, monitoring and evaluation, the external enabling environment, gender responsiveness, and collective action, and the use of collective action and group-based approaches. The results of the KAP survey indicated that practitioners in these 4 countries had a high awareness of and appreciation for elements, project design elements that were important for climate change projects. These are encouraging results suggesting active discussions of the importance of key elements during the development of national adaptation plans of action and other climate change strategies in these countries. In addition, respondents were well aware of different climate change projects and strategies being undertaken in their countries, including government programs and initiatives by multilateral organizations. However, while all of the sample organizations have a clear idea of their role in climate change adaptation and mitigation, not all of them have a strategy or policy that details their role, mandate, and resources in this regard. While all the study countries have implemented or are in the process of initiating a NAPA, the sample organizations do not seem to have clear and measurable climate change targets or a system of monitoring and evaluating to collect data and report on target achievement. In addition, gender issues are perceived to be extremely important in the project design phase by practitioners. However, we see that during project implementation, these issues do not receive as much attention. We can see this in that the reporting from respondents that more than 70% of organizations surveyed in Kenya and Ethiopia and 60% in Mali do not collect, analyze, or report gender disaggregated data as part of their climate change projects and activities. The highest percentage of organizations using, collecting, and reporting gender disaggregated data is from Bangladesh, where 75% of organizations report doing this activity. In all the countries, there seems to be a dilution effect in terms of gender integration from design to implementation to monitoring. That is, there is much greater emphasis on gender issues in planning, but much less focus on tracking gender differentiated results and outcomes. This leads to our key message that there is a need for organizational capacity strengthening for local organizations working in and providing services to rural communities, and specifically for focusing on promoting a culture of impact and monitoring and evaluation within these organizations. We see important training needs in climate change management and in gender and social analysis to really see beneficial changes at the household and community levels.
So once those 2 steps were completed, we looked at previous evidence on gender and climate change. A colleague, Amelia Go, wrote a review paper looking at 2 hypotheses. The first one is that climate-related events affect men's and women's well-being and assets differently, and that climate-related shocks affect women more negatively than men. So, unsurprisingly, she found very limited evidence from developing countries on this topic, but it did show that climate change affects women's and men's assets and well-being differently. The differences are in 6 important impact areas. First, related to agricultural production. Second, to food security. Third, health. Fourth, water and energy resources. Fifth, climate-induced migration and conflict. And 6, climate-related natural disasters. So basically both hypotheses were proven right, correct in the review paper, but at the same time the data and the evidence was very limited that Amelia could find. So what was some of the evidence that we generated through this research on gender and climate change? So this particular case study looked at focus group discussions separately for women and men in the various case study countries. So the results are as follows. First, both women and men noticed climate change impacts, and they noticed climate change itself. The key change that they saw related to changes in rainfall patterns. And that obviously makes a lot of sense because most of these farmers rely on rain-fed agriculture. So the predictability of rainfall and other weather patterns is critical for them, for both production and food security. Importantly, the genders perceived impacts of climate change differently. So men emphasized impacts on crops, and the women emphasized scarcity of resources needed for the household, and that could be both water, so less water available, and also less energy resources such as fuel wood. Importantly, most impact centered on issues related to water availability. In Bangladesh, women reported that water tables were declining, making it difficult to access water for domestic purposes, but also making it difficult to irrigate. In Ethiopia and Kenya, the emphasis was on unpredictable rainfall that made rain-fed agriculture very difficult. Bangladesh, Kenya, and Ethiopia, the water needs of livestock were also raised, as livestock is a very important asset that people rely on for in times of climate-induced shocks. In terms of findings of climatic impacts on assets, the research focused here mostly on Bangladesh and also Uganda. The first finding is, unsurprisingly, that women and men hold individual assets and they hold joint assets. And such assets include land, livestock, jewelry, but also levels of education, linkages with social networks, group membership, etc. Women tend to own jewelry and small livestock, and men tend to hold most agricultural assets, including land. Women's assets have generally a lower value than men's assets. Importantly, women's assets also have higher liquidity and are therefore more easily and quickly sold. In many cases, but not all cases, women's assets were sold when climatic shocks hit. So that could be a flood, a drought, a hailstorm, fire. On the other hand, jointly held assets were preserved to protect the family's main income source, and that tends to be agriculture. This, however, leaves women in a worse position to address future climatic and non-climatic shocks, such as illness and death. Interestingly, in Bangladesh, covariate shocks, such as droughts and floods, have a lower negative impact on family welfare than idiosyncratic shocks such as death or illness in the family, which attests to the effective protection systems in the country for these covariate shocks. So there's a lot of food and other aid and support systems when floods or droughts hit in the country. So that's a very positive sign and a positive outcome. A second important linkage between gender and climate change relates to risk aversion. We find that risk aversion is gendered. Why is risk aversion important? Both men and women, and whoever is risk averse, is less likely to take up new technologies to adapt to climate change. Several previous studies already suggested that women are more risk averse, leaving them less likely to change their agricultural practices under climatic change. Our own studies in Bangladesh and Ethiopia found that in general, women are not more risk averse than men overall, but they were more risk averse when taking decisions on agriculture. We also found for Ethiopia that education reduced risk aversion for men, whereas women's risk preferences were shaped by social interactions. Education didn't have an impact, in part probably because women were much less educated and much less literate. We also find that previous losses from climatic shocks increase risk aversion in women and men, but more so for women. So for rural women to adapt to climate change, it will be important to understand their risk preferences and improve their capacity to understand risk. Another case study looked at tenure systems and how they affect gendered climate change adaptation. The study took place in rural Ethiopia, and it looked at the knowledge surrounding the land rights reform. And why did we do that? Secure land tenure is considered essential for investments and enhanced resilience. The Ethiopian land reform has been considered a resounding success, and importantly, it was gender sensitive. Despite this, the case study by colleague Quizumbing and Kumar finds that there are large gender gaps in the knowledge about land rights in 3 domains: tenure security, land transferability, and gender rights. And these gender gaps are responsible for reduced adoption of soil conservation practices, as well as a reduced planting of tree crops and legumes. So while agricultural research centers and others have directed their efforts to improve these technologies, soil conservation, agroforestry, and have built capacity to implement those more forcefully through better extension systems, we find that increasing the knowledge of land rights may be equally important or even more important in achieving climate resilience in Ethiopia, because we cannot get women who don't understand their land rights to adopt these technologies. Efforts must therefore be directed to closing the gender knowledge gap in land rights. Many development organizations are developing agricultural technologies to help poor rural men and women adapt to climate change. However, as we find, those technologies have gendered impacts and there is gendered access to these technologies. What colleagues Dillon and Gill in a case study on Mali found first is that climate variability itself has larger negative impacts on men's, but not on women's production frontiers or production possibilities. This is likely due to the fact that women have very small plots, more like kitchen gardens, and their production is generally limited to the season where there is sufficient rainfall. When women had larger land sizes, that they were also more affected, they were equally affected by climate variability. They looked at 2 types of technologies, one irrigation and the other agricultural farm assets. They found that irrigation has a large positive effect on agricultural production for men only. It allowed them to close to offset the adverse effects of climate variability that they looked at. Women, on the other hand, had very limited access to irrigation, and therefore this technology did not help them to offset climate variability shocks. In terms of other farm assets, they found that motorized tillers only benefited men, and women were again locked out of this adaptation strategy because they were not given any access. More traditional assets like plows, on the other hand, did benefit men and women equally because they were more equally shared. However, the overall benefit of plows was lower than the benefit of irrigation, unsurprisingly. Mali is a very dry, arid country. We thus cannot assume that women and men will benefit equally from irrigation and other technologies. So when agriculture technologies are being developed, it's very important to ensure that men and women get the information about the technologies, get access to the technologies, otherwise they will not benefit. A second strand of research focused on the potential of community-based approaches to help rural women develop assets and adapt to climate change. Similar to the research on climate change impacts and assets, we first did a review paper, specifically Brian and Beerman did a review paper on the role and evidence of community-based adaptation. The review paper suggests that community-based adaptation is a promising approach to increasing resilience to climate change due to the following characteristics. it does require that people work together, so basically it requires collective action. Community-based approaches help to incorporate information about long-term changes in climate, and basically people pool this information, and it allows them to jointly incorporate anticipated impacts into planning processes. Community-based approaches generally integrate local knowledge and perceptions, so it's much less driven by the outside, emphasizes local decision-making processes, and it moves in accordance with community priorities and needs. Community-based approaches have also shown to provide important poverty reduction and livelihood benefits. However, the review suggests that the scope of participation may differ among members, and it may differ between men and women. For example, women often lack the access to the assets necessary for participation, including time, education, literacy, etc. They also find that there are likely gender differences in setting priorities through such group-based approaches to adaptation. So it's basically an important and useful approach, but it has to be taken with caution. In our work on group-based approaches, we find gender-differentiated effects. And the research was done in Bangladesh by colleagues Rakib and Mats. They find that husbands frequented groups that focused on income generation and livelihoods. Those husbands that were more literate and wealthier are found to be much more active decision makers in groups, and the husbands spend a lot more time in groups than the wives. For women, being literate and wealthy had much less impacts on their decision making in groups. They also participated much less in groups, and they focused on groups supporting mitigation of adverse shocks, particularly credit groups. But importantly, the groups were beneficial for them. They just didn't have that much time to dedicate to those groups. So policymakers should be aware that there are gender-differentiated participation rates and benefits from those groups, but they also should therefore focus to increase the active participation of women, rather than only getting more women into any type of group. So that's a very important message. Another take on group-based approaches was implemented by Beeman and Dillon in an experiment on social networks and agriculture technologies in Mali. Social networks are basically linkages between men and women through which information travels, and it could be both within relatives or among non-relatives, and generally, a lot of these social networks are developed within villages. What they find is that such networks, which are really a kind of a group-based approach, are important, but they can exacerbate existing inequities. They found that influential members of this network had much better access to the information that they were spreading, and it was information on the climate change adaptation technology in the form of composting. They also found that in those networks, women received much less information than men did. In a separate experiment where the networks were used just among women, they found that the capacity of women of transferring information about the technology and the capacity of absorbing this new knowledge was much more limited within the women's groups. Therefore, adaptation strategies that want to specifically support women or also support women will need to factor these gender disparities in. So basically, just making a technology available either to just women or women and men, in both cases, women will most likely have less capacity to absorb the knowledge and to transfer the knowledge. Another important message. An additional case study focused on agriculture insurance. Basically, insurance allows to share the risks of adverse climate events. And this study was again from Bangladesh. The findings are very interesting. First, women valued insuring against agricultural risk faced by the joint household. Even so, they are less involved in agricultural decision-making than men. And that again the reason likely is that women are fully aware that agriculture is the main income source for the entire household. However, women were disadvantaged. They have less education and lower financial literacy than their male counterparts. Also, much less background in understanding agriculture risk. This placed them at a disadvantage when facing insurance purchase decisions. So again, there's a need for capacity building targeted at women before any such insurance products should be rolled out. To sum, why gender matters for climate change adaptation. The previous slides have shown that there is a gender gap in what men and women own, and women's assets are often, but not always, sold to cope with climatic shocks. Climate information, which is essential for adaptation, is not equally available to men and women. Women have less access to agricultural technologies that support adaptation, at least in the case studies that we undertook. In both Bangladesh and Ethiopia, we found that women are more risk-averse regarding agricultural decisions. So they're less likely, if they have the information, they're less likely to take adaptation decisions. Interestingly, rural women do value risk sharing in agriculture, but their lower social capital affects the final agricultural decisions for insurance negatively. Group-based approaches for climate change adaptation can support rural women, can help to generate assets, group-owned assets such as small livestock, can provide credit in times of climatic shocks, etc. However, the quality of participation of women remains too low, and a lot of work has to be done to actually provide group-based approaches that take account of all these limitations that women face. And finally, laws and regulations such as the Ethiopian land rights reform are not sufficient for gender equality and resilience. Women actually have to understand, have to be fully aware of all the bundles of rights that come with such regulations for them to take on adaptation decisions and adaptation options. So as I've mentioned at the beginning, we have used a variety of methods here, and so I've presented on results from a really mixed methods approach. In terms of quantitative research approaches that we used, so we did a lot of econometric analysis of panel data sets. We used both existing IFPRI data sets, and we collected additional data, especially gender disaggregated data, which is obviously essential to say anything that differs for women and men in rural agriculture households. We also used experimental methods. For example, the experiment on diffusion of information about agricultural technologies, or here the case was composting in Mali. And we used experimental methods using games. And an example is the insurance purchase games with farmers in Bangladesh. And we also did a choice experiment, a lottery choice experiment in Ethiopia to gauge risk aversion between men and women. On the qualitative side of things, we used 4 different methods. First are participatory rural appraisals or focus group discussions to focus on gender differences in perceptions of climate change and adaptation strategies. We did key informant interviews of individuals with specialized knowledge, which is very helpful to kind of counterbalance farmer perceptions and to better understand why climate change adaptation policies move in one direction or other. We used Netmap, which basically maps how the stakeholders interact and influence each other on climate change adaptation, and who matters, who do you want to approach if you want to get your own climate change adaptation policy approved. And finally, we implemented a knowledge, attitudes, and practices survey, which is used to understand, how agencies see a specific issue here, climate change adaptation, specifically gender climate change adaptation, how they react to this topic throughout the project cycle and what the training needs and organizational constraints are for a specific topic. And I just wanted to quickly present, without further introduction, the key contributors to this research. They're just listed here for your information. And finally, recommended readings, basically the papers that have been summarized in the previous slides, and a list of websites, tools, and other learning resources that I hope will be of use to you. Of note, we are finalizing a toolkit on the various methods and the papers, and it will be posted soon. Thank you very much.